I'm Jeffrey, and this is the Passionate About OSS podcast. The purpose of the podcast is to shine a light on the brilliant minds of the OSS and telco industry, to describe their background, but also to share some of their knowledge, tips, and techniques. But today we'll take a look at leading global OSS BSS transformations via collaboration. Today's guest has arguably the most influential role in leading OSS and BSS transformation in the world today. He spent over 30 years working with BT, providing architectural and product leadership. This included being one of the original authors and drivers of BT's service-oriented architecture, or SOA, in circa 2008-2009, and that still persists today in its evolved state. Whilst being incredibly influential at BT, rising to become Chief Systems Architect, it's in his current role as CTO at TM Forum where he provides thought leadership that really spans the globe. Having led significant architectural transformation at BT provides a brilliant counterpoint to leading collaboration towards industry standards and patterns. It's the practical experience to balance the theoretical work that is often done in standards development. And many of you will probably have heard him talk at conferences or on recordings already, so you'll understand why I'm really excited to have him on this episode. I must also admit that I'm slightly envious of the role that he has getting to speak with leading OSS BSS practitioners around the world on a daily basis. So welcome today to George Glass.
Thank you, Ryan. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I'm looking forward to sharing some insights into my work at the forum here and giving you a little background into my career with BT.
Brilliant. So I first had the opportunity to meet George at Digital Transformation Asia, DTA, in Kuala Lumpur all the way back in 2018, though it doesn't really seem that long ago. You'd only just come across to work at TM Forum at that point, hadn't you, George?
Yeah, I left BT at the end of August in 2018 and started at the TM Forum at the start of September. It was exactly to the day 31 years after I'd started at BT. And I think my first or else second international event that I attended with the forum in my role at that stage as Vice President of Architecture and APIs was our Digital Transformation Asia session in Kuala Lumpur where I met you, Ryan.
So 30 years is an amazing stint. Was that where your telco journey started at BT?
Yes, I was a graduate straight out of university. I did a degree in IT and that was made up of mathematics, physics, computer science and engineering. But I very quickly realized as I went through that degree that I wanted to concentrate on the computer science and particularly the software engineering aspect of that. And BT had a software engineering centre here in Belfast, where I am based in Northern Ireland. And they were growing that to provide software engineers into BT Group. So we could work on any project that was being developed at the time. And it was a very exciting opportunity as we were effectively starting from scratch and growing that engineering centre very rapidly. And I think I was probably, employee number about 80, 85 or something like that. And we eventually grew to about 300 and provided key software engineering components and applications on all aspects of the architecture for BT, both in the system side and on the network side.
Fantastic. And did you already have your eyes on a career in telco from those engineering days, or was that only really after the opportunity came around at BT?
No, it was really only after the opportunity came around at BT. They would have done the milk round presentation coming to the uni and sharing information about the work that they did at the Software Engineering Centre in Belfast. And it sounded like pretty cool stuff. So that was what I was drawn to in terms of coming out of uni and trying to get a role that was going to use my skills that I'd learnt at university. I didn't know that I was going to spend 31 years with BT. That was really just by accident. But I didn't end up spending 31 years doing the same job. My career changed significantly and substantially throughout my time with BT.
Absolutely. And you rose to really significant leadership roles as well. And do you still enjoy coding today? Do you still dabble in it at all?
I try not to. My two sons have both done masters in computer science, and as part of that, we're learning how to program, and I had to help them. The only problem was that the last time that I programmed commercially, the application and the languages that they were programming in hadn't been invented. So I was having to learn Java on the fly to help them with their master's course as we were looking at some of the software engineering problems. And occasionally, I will get into the software engineering side of things and the code side of things, but it's more on a review basis, so I can actually review the code and understand what's going on. Probably better not to have me writing code at the moment, but...
And did you find that you were getting passionate about it again? We're helping your sons out?
I really enjoyed it, and I remembered why I got such a buzz out of writing software. I think it's partly just the way my mind works. I'm quite a logical thinker. I look for the patterns in everything and then try to abstract those patterns and simplify all aspects of life. And I was, that's really what software is about. Can you spot the patterns? Can you abstract it? And then can you codify it? Particularly if you're trying to develop reusable software, which has always been a strong passion of mine.
Yeah, absolutely. Same for me too. Do you recall very many of those early projects that you got to work on at BT?
Oh, yes. Yeah. I started actually writing code for network management and network management systems. And did that for a number of years, and then started to work on projects around charge auditing. And actually, it was a rather poignant moment just before I retired from BT. As the chief systems architect, I had access to our inventory of all of the active systems. And I thought I'll just have a browse to see what's the oldest system that's still in production that I worked on. And there was an application called CardView, which was a charge auditing system on our switches. And it was still live in an operational service. And it had been deployed, I think, in 1989 or 1990. And in 2018, it was still performing its function that it had been designed to do very elegantly and very efficiently. And I remember at the time when I was writing the code, looking at the application and realizing that the logic was going to have some problems whenever we changed from 1999 to the year 2000. Mm-hmm. So in 1989, 11 years ahead of the Y2K issue that hit the telecoms and computing industry worldwide, I had actually spotted the problem and had coded the application correctly to actually roll over from 1999 to 2000 without any interruption in service and without having to go and rewrite the code for Y2K compliance. And I think that probably said more about my mindset in terms of looking for anomalies, looking for patterns, looking for things that could trip people up, and then thinking about that bigger picture, even when I was a developer coder 1 or 2 years into my career.
Mm-hmm. And did that inspire you to take that same concept to maybe some of your other colleagues and point it out to them to be looking forward all the way to Y2K as well?
Well, I didn't spot that on the Y2K side because we were working in very small teams at the time. Yep. So everything was quite insular. You were quite protected and quite siloed. But certainly, as my career began to expand and I started to get into the move from a coding role and testing role more into initially a project management, but realized that wasn't where I really wanted to be. So started to focus more on design and design patterns and working on end-to-end designs for solutions. Then I was very keen to sort of evangelize that and share that with my colleagues and let them understand how you could actually code stuff to be reusable and how you could take, when you're working on a piece of code, don't just think about it in the context of what you're using it for today, but think of it in the context of another area of interest and then apply the logic or the thinking that would make it work in that space. So, for example, whenever I'm looking at products and product modeling in the telco space, I also will look at it way beyond telco and say, let's just apply this to life. I'm passionate about cars and I like cars. So let's apply our product model to see would it work to model a car and the production of a car and the sale of a car and the management and support of a car. And that just makes you think differently. It makes you think about designing a solution, not just for the current scenario, but for multiple other scenarios. And that just brings a much wider scope into the problem. And it then gives you for a much more elegant solution and a much more reusable solution. And that was really where I was started to get my passion about reusable components and reusable code, and to think bigger and then see, can I design this to be reusable under multiple scenarios? And then it's much more likely to work under the constrained scenarios that I'm working with today.
Mm. And I guess that also led through all the way to your SOA initiative, which I've heard stories that initiative saved BT hundreds of millions of dollars or more over the years. Is that true? And is that one of the bigger achievements you managed to bring through for BT along those lines?
If you go back into the good old days, whenever you used to have your charging, and this is where I'd done the work on charge auditing and then got involved in a big billing project in BT called Billing 90s. And we were trying to not only provide consolidated billing because we had multiple billers within the organization, but we also wanted flexible billing. So we're trying to take the pricing and the charging off the switches, because at that stage you used to put the tariffs onto the switches, and the switches were configured with the tariffs on them. And whenever you did a tariff revision or a build, we had to roll out simultaneously to 3,000 switches across the UK the tariff bills, and it was prone to error, and you had local charging and then national charging, and it was a mess. And we took a look at it and we thought we could actually design this as a completely standalone component that would be outside of the switches. We would collect the call records off the switches, we would price them, and then we would fire them into billing. And we looked at it, and I worked with a colleague, and he and I looked at it and we said, I think to do this, we can do it on a Unix box. Now, bear in mind, everything was done on mainframes, coded in COBOL in those days. We said, we're going to code this in C or C++. We're going to do it on a Unix box, and we're going to take the switch records, feed them through the Unix box, price them, and then fire them into the billing system. We worked out we were going to have to price 1,000 calls per second. And we reckoned then that was beyond the capability or the possibility of technology at the time. So we said, if we ran 10 Unix boxes, the biggest you could buy, in parallel, that would reduce the capacity to 100 calls price per second. So we thought, right, with 10 boxes, 100 calls per second, that would give us 1,000 per second. We think we can make it work. And we started the work in May of about 1989 or 1990. And we delivered the solution the following summer. So in about 10 months, 11 months. And we actually ended up using 8 boxes in live, 1 in development. And we had a spare in case one of the live boxes fell over. Now, that was the first time we'd actually componentized a big element of the architecture, pricing. We had standardized it. We designed it to be rules and data driven. And what actually happened was then we went from meter-based charging to per second pricing. And that was estimated to be worth over £300 million to BT, as in terms of benefit, in terms of customer satisfaction. And we even did things like we launched a special product called the Sunday Special. On a Sunday afternoon, you could make free calls between 3 o'clock and 4 o'clock to family and friends, to loved ones. Actually, talking to family and friends, we were in partnership with MCI at the time, and we had permission from them to use the term family and friends. We launched family and friends pricing discounts where you got free calls between the top 5 selected family call numbers. And those different pricing initiatives actually generated hundreds of millions of pounds for BT. The interesting thing is the Sunday Special that ran from 3 o'clock to 4 o'clock, actually in the advertising leading up to it, people started to use it before they were getting free calls. And then post the period of time that we ran the campaign for, people had got into the habit of phoning their loved ones on a Sunday afternoon and kept using the service. And we actually had a spike in the usage of the network on a Sunday afternoon for a number of years.
A busy hour, so to speak.
Simple things like that just it completely changed the way BT sold its products and services in the marketplace. And I was very proud to be part of that. And actually, the work that we did ended up with some work that I did on what we called our pricing and assembly engine that had worldwide patents. And I'm named as one of the designers for the software on that patent, along with like two of my colleagues.
Yeah, and that componentized billing, that would have been quite revolutionary. That would have then rippled out all the way around the globe too, I imagine.
Yeah, that was the start of it. We then said, right, we would love to take it further. That was the pricing bit. We did network mediation to collect the call records, and then we did invoice production and discounting functions. Built a lot of those components ourselves. And then we started to say it was the start of the implementation of COTS package, commercial off-the-shelf packages. And we started to work with Keenan billing systems and with Geneva billing systems when we deployed. I think we were probably one of the first operators to deploy those as components of our architecture. The Keenan billing system went in to do our data private circuit billing. And the Geneva application went in to do our voice services. And obviously, the Geneva system, it's morphed, it's transformed over the years, but it was then, I think Geneva was acquired by Convergys, and then Convergys were acquired by Netcracker. And, it's still providing billing function to BT today.
Fantastic. And then over the period, so from those amazing technological advancements, you then quickly rose into leadership roles. Really impressive progression. So head of strategy and architecture, director of platform design and build, VP, and then chief architect at Global Services. Are you able to describe some of the projects that you're most proud of that came under your direction across those real leadership roles, where you became perhaps less hands-on?
Yeah, so I was sort of head of billing whenever I worked with BT and MCI to do a joint venture there. And I'd cut my teeth doing a lot of work in the billing area and the charging, as I talked about there. And that was an activity that went on for about 2 years, working with a number of my colleagues from BT, a number of my colleagues from AT&T, and from the concert joint venture that BT had launched with MCI a number of years previously. From that, whenever that work came to an end, I actually came back into BT and worked in retail on the consumer side of it was actually across the whole of retail. And we actually put the first early implementation of what's now the open digital architecture. It was I'm working with on the TM forum. That first concept came in where we had a component-based architecture. It was based on a CRM application, a billing application, and a service orchestration application, all driven by a product catalog to represent the retail side of BT's business. And we deployed a Siebel-based CRM system. I think at one stage we had the largest Siebel installation in the world. It was the early days. I think it was like Siebel 5 that we were deploying. The billing was based on Geneva, then Convergys, then Netcracker. And we built our own service orchestration component because nobody had actually built a component-based architecture. And that was the start of our service-oriented architecture and componentized architecture, fed by a product catalog to drive the flexibility and the functionality of those components. And that, was deployed into both our consumer side of the operation, into the business side, and into our major business side. So it was like 3 instances of that architecture deployed across retail. I then moved into a consolidated group architecture role whenever we were then trying to build what was the BT matrix architecture, a single multi-tenancy architecture where we would build common services and reuse those across the different lines of business. And that was a very exciting time because, that was the first time we started to really think about the exposure of business functionality via open APIs. We called them SDKs. In BT, that was how we were building set of components with SDKs, was how you talk to the component. It was its open API. And that formed the basis of the transformation of BT's entire architecture. And I was really driving the work under what we call platform design and build. So we had basically come up with a series of platforms for our overall business, modeled the business around 13 platforms, and then put a set of components into each of those platforms. We call them sub-platforms that expose the business functionality via our SDKs. And that was really quite groundbreaking because we were using XML, which was the technology at the time. JSON REST hadn't really been invented. And we were trying to see, could we abstract the way CRM spoke to billing, the way product catalogs spoke to billing, the way product catalogs spoke to CRM, so as we could deliver a single 360-degree view of the customer. We could rules and data drive the functionality. So we weren't writing code. We weren't on the critical path in an IT department from the launch of products and services. And that was a very exciting time just to see our thought patterns around the architecture becoming implemented and realized in the applications that we were deploying to our customers. And that really continued from that point on for the rest of my time in BT, just coming up with architectural patterns for those deployments. And then I spent a period of time as the chief architect of global services. And that was, at that stage, we were trading in 176 countries worldwide, selling network services and extended network reach into many of those countries for global multinational corporations, and trying to deliver common services, common solutions, and trying to work with a set of disparate sales teams that were working on a very much geographical basis, and trying to convince them that you could actually build common solutions, common components, and deliver a common architecture that would actually help them in their business and not hinder them.
Mm. Those precursor architectures to ODA that you talk about, we're talking back before 2010 here too, aren't we?
Yes, yeah. So I was working in the global services space in 2008, 2009. That was an interesting time because it had been the financial crash worldwide with the banking crisis. And the one good thing was that some of the operating companies that we're dealing with who had been flush with cash previously didn't have quite so much money to invest or to build their own solutions. So they were sort of forced to come to me and the IT team to build common solutions. And that's where we really were first time able to show that you could actually build, a common CRM system that was shared between Italy and France and Spain, and you could make it work. It could handle multiple languages. It was simplified because we were all using the euro then, so you weren't having to do multiple currencies. But you were selling different products in different regions. So yes, that was a very interesting time for us to be working on those sort of areas and actually trying to deliver effectively an architecture that wouldn't look out of place today in many operational companies, but without the technology of today. So we were, in one sense, probably a little bit ahead of the technology in our architectural thinking, but having to work with the technology that was available to us to actually deliver the solutions.
And the SDKs that you talked about, were you developing those for internal use, or were they for partners or even externals?
So the concept was a combination of both. So the internal SDKs were effectively inter-platform SDKs, so that effectively the billing platform would talk to the customer management platform via a set of SDKs. But then within billing, there would be internal SDKs as well. So we had the concept of both internal and external from the platform perspective. But then we were also realizing, well, actually, this is going to be a simpler way for other organizations to interact with BT. And we had gone through the regulatory change that was being driven by the formation of Openreach in the UK, which was the management of the last mile on the access on the consumer side of the business, or consumer and business side of the UK. And Openreach was being formed. And we wanted to do things like, offer things like an availability checker, so that at any address in the UK, you could determine what sort of speed of connection you could get and what connectivity was available at that address. And we were already building those capabilities internally within BT to use them, and then realized, well, actually, under the regulation of equivalence of input, we had to make that available to all retail organizations, all service providers that were trading in the UK on an equivalent basis. We couldn't have a faster interface or a more reliable interface between Openreach and one part of BT, and then have a different interface to the other operators that were trading in the UK. And that's where the SDK started to come into their own, because we could build in a standard interface and we could build a standard set of equivalent interfaces that all of the service providers would use. And that was, the start of some very, very strong engineering activity that produced a lot of very reusable services. And actually, a lot of that work ended up winding its way down to your neck of the woods. And NBN copied a lot of the work that we did there around the access management and so forth. And that work was then shared collaboratively through the TM forum, and through that NBN picked it up. And we started to see standardization of services, not just within the UK, but globally, starting to adopt the same patterns.
Mm. And the structural separation of Openreach, had that been mooted years prior and therefore had helped form your architectural componentization, or was that just a useful byproduct that, having done the architecture that you had in a componentized way, that it actually allowed easier structural separation?
At various times, there have been different conversations since BT had been privatized about breaking it up and selling it off and renationalizing it and so forth. So we had developed the architecture that was a componentized architecture. And then finally, the government made their announcement as to what was going to happen in terms of the last mile and the management of that. And whilst it still was an enormous piece of work, it actually accelerated our architecture, because it drew very clear lines between what was our retail business, our wholesale unregulated business, and then our regulated wholesale business and Openreach. So there was quite complex regulation. It was to do with market dominance and to drive competition, and fortunately, as I said, the componentization of the architecture actually was a good step in the right direction, but it wasn't sufficient, and we had extra work to do. But we used it as any good architect would. You use a crisis like that to actually further the architecture and actually follow the correct patterns and abstract the capabilities so that they're exposed in a standard format, that makes it easier to actually integrate and connect components together, or to bring other parties into the picture going forward. And that's really what we did. We added that to other transformation initiatives that were going on within BT and across the UK, and just kept using that to accelerate the implementation of the architecture.
Yeah, and it would have forced investment as well. I mean, forced business cases for some fairly fundamental change, which would have been good.
That's you're always you can come at it from an architectural perspective with the purity of thought, saying I'm going to make the simplest, most elegant architecture, but sometimes you can't justify it. So you've got to always look for the waves of transformation that are coming along and see if you can ride one of those waves to actually get your architecture implemented. And that could be, a realization that there's fierce competition. It could be the availability of new technology that you can exploit. It could be the start of the merger of products and services, or the combination of products and services making very attractive offers in the marketplace, that then there's a big revenue opportunity. Or it can be legal and regulatory changes. So there's a whole number of things that you as an architect, you have to look for those opportunities and then try and maximize the benefit of those opportunities to convert that into, the deliverables that are going to make your architecture future-proof, going to make the adoption and the implementation of other solutions that are going to have to be flexible and cope with those sorts of changes in the future more practical and more relevant. So you're always looking for, how am I going to fund this? How can I make this real? Because I have to deliver business value every step of the way. Every time I make a change, I have to be making my customer's life better. I've got to be improving the service. I've got to be taking cost out of the operation. I've got to be delivering more simplified processes. I've got to enable more of my customers' operations and transactions to be self-served as opposed to contact center served. With those sort of backdrop of rules going on in your mind all of the time, you're always looking for what's the next best opportunity, what's the next best scenario that I can actually take and use to further the solutions that we're pushing out to our customers.
Yeah, I love it. That's a real insight for me too, I guess, is really looking for those burning platforms on which to build a transformation or a re-architecture. And the fact that you've just called out a lot of those different styles of burning platform as well. And speaking of waves of technology too, so at Global Services, you would have really had that big network services perspective on service offerings, but then the advent of cloud is obviously a really big thing for us today. When were you first aware of cloud concepts being a different beast from those network services that BT had provided to multinationals before?
I had a colleague who worked in and around the infrastructure of our data centers, and he kept talking to me about decoupling the application from the infrastructure. And to be honest, at the start, the first couple of times he explained it, whether I'm just a slow learner or he wasn't great at explaining, I didn't catch on about what he was talking about. Because I was in the process of developing and designing applications where you had to configure the hardware, the storage, the infrastructure for that application in a bespoke manner, depending on whether it was going to be batch-based or whether it was online, whether it was transaction-heavy, whether it was high on the database IOs. And I'm thinking, how can I make that infrastructure effectively appear like limitless? How can I make it appear infinite? I just don't get what this guy's talking about. And it rumbled on for a number of years. And then in about 2005 or 2006, we started to talk about transforming our data center and implementing what we called modular infrastructure. And that was the start of effectively us building our own private cloud within our data center in BT. And we worked on that for probably a year and a half or whatever. And I was project managing the release of the modular infrastructure work. And we had converted an entire data center to modular infrastructure. And we had been sort of backing up the demand for space in our data centers for a month or so by saying, look, this new capabilities come along. It's going to be very easy to consume infrastructure and you can get it on demand. And we launched the product, if you like, modular infrastructure, and we effectively sold out in less than a week. We completely filled the data center. Partly it was the user's behavior wasn't right because they had always sized for maximum capacity, and it always took such a long time to procure hardware and storage and all the rest of it that, even if they were building an application that was going to support 10 customers for the first year, they would have sized it for 10,000. And so they come in asking for the capacity for 10,000, which is why we use it. But it all was used up in the first week. So I went back to the team that were building the data center and said, can we now convert the next data center? And they went, no, because we don't have the funding for it. We'll have to wait till next year to get the funding. And I'm thinking, this model is completely broken. It's based on effectively like an OpEx model where you rent the capacity that you need when you need it, but we're building it using a CapEx model. So we're having to invest all of the CapEx to build it. And that's not going to work unless you do it at massive, massive scale. And obviously, as an operator, even though we were maybe spending tens of millions of pounds, that's not massive scale. And actually, in some research that I've done when I was looking into the hypercloud providers, from publicly available material and information published, it would appear that the three Western hypercloud providers, AWS, Google, and Microsoft, invested something in the region of 30 billion initially, and then are spending about £10 billion per annum on their cloud platform and cloud infrastructure. And that's the sort of level you have to invest at to get cloud capacity, storage, compute on demand to appear as if it's infinite. And that's whenever we created the work on our modular infrastructure that I realized we were onto something, that you could actually now abstract the application from the infrastructure, and you could start to build stuff in the cloud, be it private, public, or hybrid cloud. So, the thinking was there. And that was whenever I realized this is really going to transform the way we actually run and operate and manage our business. And this is groundbreaking in terms of how I'll actually, deploy software and run software in the future.
To segue a little bit back onto TM Forum, so you talked about the use of some of the BT architectures that were then brought into TM Forum, used by NBN down here in Australia and others. So you received an Outstanding Contributor Award from TM Forum in 2016, and then anointed with the Distinguished Fellowship in 2018, which basically means OSS BSS God status. I assume that there was already a really close relationship even before you joined TM Forum officially after those 30 years with BT.
Yeah, so around about 2014, I think it was, BT always had like a primary contact or representative into the TM Forum. And I had worked with them on and off. I'd spoken at some of their conferences and things like that. But in 2014, I think it was, I became BT's primary contact into the TM Forum. And it was round about then that we kicked off the work on what's now called the Open Digital Architecture, and specifically the Open API program. And
was it that early? Wow.
Yeah, it was I think it was 2015 we actually formally kicked off the Open API program. And it was myself as the chief architect in BT, and some of my peers from Orange and Vodafone, Laurent Leboucher and Lester Thomas and a number of others, who we actually were working in, I think it was possibly through the collaboration subcommittee within the TM Forum, which is almost like the operating committee of what is the project this forum work on. And we're saying, we've all connected customer management to billing. We've all connected product catalogs to product ordering, product catalogs to customer management, tens of times or maybe even hundreds of times in our careers. This is madness. There's no intrinsic value in that. It should be standardized, but it's not. Why don't we kick off a piece of work to build some open APIs that would standardize the interconnection between these key components of everybody's architecture? Because everybody's got these components. Everybody's doing this plumbing or hardwiring of these components together.
And they're all using concepts like SID and those kind of common data models.
Exactly. So a lot of the foundations were in place that would allow us to do that. And we said, look, let's build the APIs. And I said, look, the best way to do this is to crowdsource them. So what I did was I went back to BT and got permission, explained what we were going to try and do within the forum, and got permission to actually bring the BT interface specifications for the billing, our SDK for billing, our SDK for customer management, our SDK for a product catalog, brought those to the TM Forum, and actually joined together with my colleagues from Vodafone and Orange and other operators and other vendors even, and said, if you were starting again, and as an architect, you rarely got the chance to start with a clean sheet and redesign something that you've already designed, how would you redesign these interfaces and how can you do it? So we looked at the customer management interface, the billing, customer billing account interface, the account appointment interface and things like that. And actually just went through the designs and shared in a lot of detail, how did Vodafone do it? How did Orange do it? How did we do it in BT? And then we said, well, we're going to have to write it down in a rigorous manner. We can't just capture it in a Word document. And that's where we said, well, let's use JSON REST. Let's use that as a specification. Pierre Gauthier, the TM Forum's chief API architect, was in there. His heritage and background had been in OSSJ, so he came with a lot of understanding and knowledge in that space. We came in with the working interfaces from the operators, and we started to design the APIs, and we kicked off what we called spec jams, specification jamborees, where we would get together for 3 days in one of the members' locations. We would host it. The TM forum would run the event. We would host it in BT, or it'd be hosted in Vodafone or wherever. And, the teams would come together, and we would actually literally sit and go through and design the interface. And that's what we set out to do. And having then built the JSON REST specification and constructed the Swagger file, we said, well, look, inherently, developers are lazy. They like to download stuff and use it. So why don't we actually not just design the Swagger file and give the specification? Why don't we actually build a reference implementation of this API? And hence the reference implementations of the APIs came along. And then because we were actually thinking outside the box, again, I was using my analogies of cars and things like that. So I'm designing an API for customer management or for billing. And I say, well, I want to be able to build telco, but say I wanted to sell this into the automotive industry, and I wanted to be able to build for cars and car parts and engines and engine components. How do I model that? Can it still handle all of that? And that's where the whole concept of having, the payloads of the APIs passed by reference, been able to look up a product catalog and actually understand the instance of the reference, what it means in terms of attributes or features. And therefore you had, mandatory elements of the API, which everybody had to have, and then extendable optional elements that you could add your own payload and extend the API to suit your own needs. And then we built, the clear set of design patterns around how you build an API, and then supply and constructed a CTK, a conformance test kit, that says, well, this is a good way, if I've extended the API, to verify that I haven't broken any of these design principles, any of these patterns, all of the mandatory elements are present, and so forth. And that was effectively the birth of the Open API project. And we started then to drive that and said, well, how do we get adoption? Well, as operators, if we, through the forum, commit through a manifesto that says every time we issue an RFP, we will insist that the interconnection and the integration of new components into our architecture or between existing components of our architecture will be done via the relevant APIs. And, that kicked off with I think we launched the manifesto. 8 of our members of the TM forum, including BT, signed that manifesto. And we had 18 APIs at the time that were in their first or second iteration. And we said, that's the basis of interconnecting between those operators. And to be honest, it's gone from strength to strength. And I've got heavily involved in the Open API project. And then on the back of that, the Open Digital Architecture project has just gained momentum as more and more people follow those patterns of the APIs. And you've got the decoupling of the components via the APIs. The next logical thing was, well, let's define the components that make up ODA, and let's actually, start to build and make available a reference architecture, ultimately aiming for the concept of a plug and play component within an architecture to remove an enormous amount of friction of actually implementing and delivering solutions to our customers today. And that's, how I got involved in the work as initially BT's representative into the TM forum, and very actively involved in both the ODA project and the Open API project. And, very kindly, the TM forum recognized my contribution through, as you said, my Outstanding Contribution Award in 2016, and then being nominated as a fellow into the TM forum in 2018.
And clearly you're really, really passionate about that work. So was that one of the really big drivers for why you then took the role over at TM forum after finishing up with BT?
Yeah, it's one of those things, I'd worked for BT for 31 years. BT was moving on. It was going through the next phase of its transformation. And I realized that I wasn't getting any younger, and I was really enjoying the work that I was doing with the TM forum. And an opportunity came for me to leave BT and to join the TM forum. And it seemed like too good an opportunity to miss. So as I said, at the end of August 2018, I left my colleagues in BT, though I still talk to them, at least once a month, if not once a week, because they're still heavily involved in obviously the TM forum and doing some fantastic and exciting things in BT. I moved across into the TM forum to take over responsibility for ODA and the APIs.
And as I mentioned in the intro, I'm really jealous that you're now getting to come into senior discussions around OSS, BSS at many different operators around the world because you're wearing that independent hat of representing the forum. Now, I'd previously assumed that would really give you the behind the veil visual and a different perspective. But from what you've just described, with all of the deep collaboration with Orange and Voda and others, it seems like you already had that behind the veil visibility anyway.
Well, you had it to a certain extent, Ryan, to be honest. Obviously, when I'd be telling my colleagues from Vodafone and Orange what we were doing in BT, they would hear the slightly rose-tinted version of what was going on and maybe not hear it all, warts and all. But since I've taken up the role in the TM forum, it's like whenever I go in to talk to a member or prospective member about their digital transformation, about the state of their OSS, BSS, then I'm going like, I'm independent now. I have no alliance or allegiance to any particular vendor or any vendor's product. We're absolutely neutral as far as the vendor's concerned. We work with all of the vendors that are members, and I work with all of the operators. And we obviously have strong confidentiality agreements with our members. So I will talk about scenarios, but I'll not tell you which operator was involved in that scenario unless they're willing to share it with us as a case study or something like that. And that meant that I've had the opportunity to actually go in and talk to many, many of our members over the almost 3 years that I've been with the forum and get the insight into what's working and what's not working. And also then, just because of that, it gives me added information, added knowledge that I can then share with the members in terms of, I've seen another member of a similar size to you that are trying to do same things and are becoming stuck with X, Y, or Z. You might be having problems in the same areas. And it's funny, because obviously in many of our members, and if you're an architect or a CIO or whatever, and you're looking at your set of problems, you think, these are unique to me. These are unique to my organization. They're unique to my geography. Actually, that's a myth that I like to dispel very quickly. We see a lot of the same problems happening with the same types of companies, just slightly different scenarios. And it's, you can't stop the march of time. So even organizations that were formed 4 or 5 years ago and built the most elegant agile architecture 5 years ago suddenly realize at some point in time, oh, I've got technical debt. I've now got legacy. My business strategy has changed. I've now entered a new market. I've now acquired another company, and I've got 2 product catalogs and 2 billing systems and 2 CRM systems. Life was so much simpler when I had 1 product, 1 region, 1 set of customers, and all I was focused on was growing customers in that space. Now, and a typical example that I would see is mobile companies. Mobile companies through the 2G, 3G, 4G era were just focused on acquiring customers and driving up ARPU. They had a relatively simple set of systems and a relatively simple interface into the mobile mass network. And then the rest of the mobile calls were obviously carried on the fixed network. And they had quite a simple operating model. Suddenly, as the revenues slowed down, as they had to invest in new mobile technologies like 5G, then suddenly the 5% or 10% growth per annum disappeared. And they were looking to say, oh, how can I cut costs? How can I rationalize systems? How can I reduce my technical debt? And then it was like, oh, I can grow new revenues if I started to sell broadband services or over-the-top services like TV services or video services. But the applications that I have are not geared up for that. How do I get those capabilities built into my current architecture? And suddenly, people who didn't think they had technical debt or didn't think they had a big architectural transformation required or technology transformation required are suddenly realizing that actually they've got quite a bit of heavy lifting to do. And it's not just the incumbents that have got legacy. The new starts, the challengers are now sitting with legacy because the applications and the components that they built to manage their 2G and 3G networks are still there. They're trying to manage the 4G networks. They're trying to prepare for 5G, and they're trying to then bring on over-the-top movie services, bring in fixed line broadband services to extend their customer base. And they suddenly realize, gosh, I could do with some help in this. Where's an architecture? Where's a pattern that does multi-tenancy, that does multiple products and services through a standard abstracted set of components that deliver standard business functionality? I've heard those guys at the TM Forum have got something called ODA that does some of that. I better go and talk to George. So that's one of the great things about the role I'm in now, is that I can actually help a lot of our members with what looked like their elegant architecture of 4 years ago is now something that is slowing them down, is reducing their agility, is lengthening their time to market. And we've seen it many, many times before. And we've got architectural patterns, architectural components, and architectural interfaces that will actually help them on that journey.
Brilliant. And we've come pretty much to the end of time for the interview. It's just been brilliant to chat about a lot of the history behind these standards that are just really starting to become burgeoning technologies now. For people who may be interested in continuing on the conversation, George, where can people find you?
If you come to the TM Forum website, you'll find links or connections to me. I'm on LinkedIn, and also my email is just wgglass@tmforum.org. Quite simple. And if somebody is interested in some of the work that I'm doing, very happy to chat to them or to share information on what we're doing with the TM Forum and the work that we've got going on with ODA. I just say, as I come to the end, we designed ODA from the outset as a component-based architecture focusing on IT, but it's an architecture for managing software. And the most exciting thing that I've got going on at the moment is the fact that the network is becoming software. It's ripe for componentization. It's ripe for looking at the network as a series of components that expose their business functionality via industry standard open APIs, and been able to abstract those APIs and actually simplify the operations and management of tomorrow's networks. And that's an area that the TM Forum and ODA are moving into at pace, and it's gaining momentum on a daily basis as we actually look at what we call our autonomous operations program, and under that our autonomous networks projects and our cloud native network project looking at the componentization of the network. So although, we've done a lot of work in the IT space, the work in the network space is just starting, and the requirements there to actually not just do automation, that's just the start of it, but to actually truly get autonomous networks where the people that are associated with the management of the network are there to observe what's happening, but not to manage it. The management of the network is done by the machine learning and AI systems that are programmed to actually control and operate the network. And we take more and more people out of the processes associated with the management of the network. One, it'll make it more reliable, because the less times people touch it, the less times it will break. And two, just given the complexity and the number of devices that are going to be in tomorrow's network, it's too big a problem for any human to try and get their mind around. So we need to think about different ways of managing the network of the future. And that's where we see ODA playing a very strong role in terms of applying a lot of the patterns and the principles and the policies of an architecture that looks at an abstracted set of open APIs for managing business functions or business capabilities in a standard manner as being very relevant into the network space. So that's where we're taking ODA, and we'd love you to join us on that journey.
Brilliant. And a really exciting journey too. Really excited to see what comes next. For as much as we've achieved, there's still so much more that is yet to be achieved. And it's been brilliant listening to all of the insights today, George. Clearly you are passionate about OSS and deserving of a place here on the podcast. So thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you, Ryan. It's been a pleasure to join you.
Thanks for listening to the Passionate About OSS podcast. You can find more episodes, more than 2,500 blogs, and our contact details over at passionateaboutoss.com.